I mean, well, that is the other point, is that this is again multifaceted in that we're attempting, or you need to, as you look at your AI governance approach, you need to be addressing everything from privacy concerns to competitive information leaking to actual outright security issues to things like cost and power consumption, because you can, especially as organizations start experimenting with more roll your own AI, they're going to be bearing those costs directly. Right now, we've been sort of shielded from it, right? Almost all of the major AI plays have been in these sort of captive environments where somebody else is shouldering all that risk, and you're paying this predictable monthly cost, even if it's a high monthly cost in the case of like Microsoft's copilots, but it's predictable. I think, we've talked a lot in the past about people like Snowflake and Databricks and others that are starting to bring the idea of custom LLMs. I've certainly talked to certain executives that are experimenting with this idea of building custom LLMs. And when you start going down that road, now suddenly you're bearing these costs directly, or at least part of the cost directly. And that starts changing the game pretty dramatically. Which leads to the last sort of topic that right now I think is sort of a degree or two removed from most enterprises, but is going to become more prevalent and more relevant, or at least potentially so, in the future. And that's this whole question of the rising cost of the power consumption of AI, both from training these models, which will mostly be restricted to the very large foundational model companies, but more importantly, on the inference side, that that I think has dramatic potential impact for the enterprise if they start having to pay for those inference tokens, which right now they aren't most of the time. And so, I think it's an interesting thing. And there are a couple different articles I know that you pointed out that are pointing to some of this. So I was curious what your take was on all of it.
Yeah, the one of the articles that got my attention was a recent TechCrunch article about Phaidra, which just raised a $12 million round to support data center energy consumption. And I think this is going to be one of these issues that increasingly comes back into IT. We've already been talking about green IT to some extent and some ESG type reporting, especially if you're based in, if you have significant EU operations. But I think that's going to be increasingly important. And we're going to see electricity come even more into the CIO's purview once again, simply because AI requires so much power from training and inferencing and ongoing optimization perspective. There's just no way around it because these models are so big and require so much compute, and then the storage and networking that go around with it, that there's no way to get around the power issues that are currently associated with AI.
Well, I mean, so from an enterprise perspective, the way around it is you don't do it. You said, you outsource that. You use a cloud provider of this, which again is the predominant way that we're accessing AI today. And I guess so. My question for you is, do you think this is going to be a barrier, right? We've talked a lot about enterprise adoption. We've talked about customizing AI, specifically LLMs, and that it could be a chief driver of innovation and a chief driver of differentiation. And I think that's all true. But I could also see that if you're an enterprise CIO today, particularly on the larger side where you're maybe thinking about going down this road, that it could give you pause, that it could say, I don't know if I'm going to wade into this. I'm not, I don't want to be responsible for a nuclear plant to be able to, or my data center, which by the way is something that some of the major providers are talking about now, is like literally spinning up nuclear plants to try to drive this. So, I'm curious, would it give you pause? If you were putting yourself back into that seat?
Gosh, I think part of the challenge, the nuclear power thing makes me think, are we going to move everything to France where they have great nuclear power? Maybe that's why Paris has all these AI startups. Yeah, but that aside, I think part of the challenge right now is also that we are dealing with a lot of unoptimized systems. We have not optimized our power consumption for AI. We are not optimizing the size of our models to be efficient. We are still depending on these GPUs and all of NVIDIA's chips, although a lot of AI doesn't training and support doesn't actually require that capability throughout the entire compute cycle. So if we could like shift between CPU and GPU more efficiently, we might be able to get some efficiencies there. I honestly think we're going to get rid of 80 to 90% of the waste that exists in AI right now over the next 2 to 3 years, which will actually make this power thing much easier. But simply saying it's probably going to happen isn't something that you can invest in if you are trying to do AI today. In the here and now, we are still dealing with all this unoptimized stuff, and you have to go dive into it if you want to get in the game today and know what's going and actually have something that works.
I mean, clearly the optimization angle is what Phaidra is all about, right? That's
Mhm.
that whole angle there. And I also, we've covered this in the past about some emerging approaches. I mean, we simply didn't need them in the past, right? So emerging approaches that
Right.
are changing the computational models to make them more efficient. I think we're going to see that innovation on the chip level. Certainly, NVIDIA's last round, they were a heavy focus on reducing the power consumption requirements of their chips. So, I mean, I think we're going to see this all around. This is, to a certain extent, I was playing a little bit of a devil's advocate. To a certain extent, I tend to be a believer when there's enough money and enough focus on something that the world sort of finds a way. And I believe that's largely going to be the case here. I also think we're probably going to see, we talked about the coming Gen AI winter. I think for a variety of reasons, we're going to see that. We're seeing the incremental improvements slow. We're seeing people having to struggle to operationalize and adapt, and that's going to slow adoption. I think all of that's going to end up creating some space. Right now, part of the challenge is we've been on this absolute tear. I mean, a year and a half or so of this just all out race. And so this massive scale up, and there's not been this opportunity to sort of take that step back and optimize. I think that Gen AI winter, whatever you end up calling it, will create that space where we're going to see some catch up. So, I mean, I'm not, if I were to ask myself that same question, I don't think I would be overly concerned about it, particularly because if I'm an enterprise player today, um, the level of my investment, the percentage of workloads that I'm actually going to be running through any of that today are still relatively small. And so my actual exposure is relatively small today, meaning I have time for all of this to sort of catch up. But I think it certainly needs to be on radar, certainly something that hasn't been on radar for quite a while. Thinking about data centers and thinking about power consumption. So I think it, is a legitimate concern. But I think I would be, cautiously optimistic that we're going to be finding pathways through this.
Yeah. One of the things I talk about over and over again in my analyst life is the IT rule of 30, just saying any unmanaged IT category will average 30% in waste. And I think AI is no exception. And once it starts becoming its own $1 million or greater bucket of spend, companies are going to go ahead and notice yet again that despite all the optimization they've done previously in cloud computing and cloud FinOps and everything else, this specific AI bucket still has its own 30% category of optimization potential. And that's not necessarily going to be something that you care about initially, because honestly, when you get started, you're always just trying to make it work. And you're going to have to spend some money to make that happen. But over time, probably a year or two from now, when some of this stuff goes into operation, this will start to actually matter again. And then we're going to have this next category of AI FinOps, and we're going to find out that AI FinOps is harder than we thought it was going to be. Like everything always is. It's always harder than you thought it was going to be, because it's not just a matter of switching on and off your Amazon and Azure. You're going to find out there are all these other bits and pieces that you didn't think about.
And you will be in your glory when you have AI FinOps, right? A
Yeah,
whole new level.
I'll have. Yeah, I'm just gonna be psychic here, and people will be amazed that I understand so much of what happens when this is extremely predictable. Like we're calling it now. Like there's no reason to wait till 2026 to say that this is going to be a problem.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting. I think as an enterprise leader trying to look out, I think, so to a certain extent, we probably put a little bit too much, maybe not you and I, but I think as an industry, we put too much credence in trying to predict the future. And I think, in many cases, this is about just being smart and writing it out and trying to see the directional momentum, but
Mhm.
just don't do what some of these other organizations have done and just like pour everything into it. And that sort of cautious road of moving just fast enough, and maybe that's the trick in finding that balance. But yeah, I do think it is interesting. I think that I remember that wasn't even that long ago, 10 years ago, maybe not even. I remember sitting down with a CIO friend of mine and said, well, Charlie, I built my last data center, right? And
Mhm.
we were sure, all of us were sure that the enterprise CIO was just out of this business.
Mhm.
I mean, I talked to a CIO of a company just a year ago when basically just he told me flat out that he didn't ever want to think about infrastructure. And here we are now, where now suddenly we're talking about chips and power all over again. And so, it's the sort of interesting time, but I think it will find its new balance. And I guess my one last little thing though is that you do need to be paying attention to it. I think that there's enough at stake that you can't ignore it. You just need to kind of keep that balanced awareness.